In 1991, two children vanished without a trace while walking the familiar path to their Sunday worship. The community's faith was shattered by an evil that preyed on innocence, leaving only questions where answers should have been. 32 years of silence finally broke when church hymnals, those sacred books of devotion, emerged as silent witnesses to an unthinkable truth. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The piercing wail of police sirens shattered the Sunday morning tranquility of Cedar Falls. Captain Ray Morrison, his face set with grim determination, directed his officers along the tree-lined path that 8-year-old Jessica Parker and 6-year-old Tommy should have taken to St. Matthew's Lutheran Church. Yellow police tape fluttered in the autumn breeze as officers methodically cordoned off streets, their eyes scanning the leaf-strewn sidewalks for any sign of the missing siblings. "Check every yard, every bush," the captain ordered, his voice steady despite the growing knot in his stomach. This wasn't supposed to happen in Cedar Falls, not here, not in this close-knit community where children walked safely to church, clutching their hymnals. Outside the Parker home, neighbors gathered in hushed clusters, their faces ashen with disbelief. Mrs. Valenti wrung her hands nervously, telling anyone who would listen that she had seen the children walking past her fence earlier that morning. "They looked so sweet in their Sunday best," she whispered, her voice catching. Jessica was holding Tommy's hand, just like always. Inside, Linda and David Parker sat shell-shocked on their living room sofa, surrounded by officers asking questions they could barely comprehend. Linda's fingers twisted the fabric of her skirt as she struggled to recall every detail of that morning. "They were excited about choir practice," she murmured, her eyes fixed on the family photo on the mantel. Jessica helped Tommy with his tie. "I watched them from the porch until they turned the corner." David placed his hand over hers, his own face a mask of controlled terror. The church, which should have been filled with hymns and prayers, instead became command central for the search operation. The Reverend opened every room, while his wife made endless pots of coffee for the growing number of volunteers. Maps of Cedar Falls were spread across tables normally reserved for communion preparation, as search parties were organized and dispatched. By afternoon, the golden fields surrounding the town were dotted with searchers calling out the children's names, their voices carried away by the wind that rustled through the tall grass. The autumn sun cast long shadows as daylight began to wane, intensifying the urgency of their mission. Captain Morrison stood at the edge of town, watching as more volunteers arrived in vehicles of all descriptions. He'd served Cedar Falls for 15 years and had never seen such fear in his community. The sense of security that had defined this place was crumbling before his eyes, replaced by a creeping dread that spread from house to house like a shadow. "We'll find them," he promised David Parker as darkness approached. But the words felt hollow, even to him. The crisp October air carried the desperate calls of volunteers as they fanned out across Cedar Falls. "Jessica! Tommy!" Their voices echoed between houses as neighbors distributed flyers bearing the smiling faces of the Parker children. Elderly couples who rarely left their porches joined young parents clutching their own children's hands tighter, all united in the search for the missing siblings. Mrs. Valenti, a retired schoolteacher who lived 3 houses down from St. Matthew's, approached Captain Ray Morrison with trembling hands. "I saw them," she insisted, her voice quavering. "Jessica and Tommy Parker walked right past my fence at 9:15. Jessica was holding her little brother's hand. They looked so proper in their Sunday clothes." The captain's expression tightened. If Mrs. Valenti's timeline was accurate, the children had vanished within a 5-minute window before reaching the church. This wasn't a case of wandering off. Someone had been watching, waiting for the perfect moment. Back at the Parker home, Linda sat motionless at the kitchen table, her fingers tracing the patterns on her children's school photographs. David paced behind her, his face ashen as he answered the same questions from different officers. No, they've never wandered off before. Yes, they know not to talk to strangers. No, I can't think of anyone who would want to hurt them. By nightfall, their modest two-story house had transformed. The dining room walls, once adorned with family portraits, now displayed maps marked with red pins and possible sighting locations. The coffee table disappeared beneath timelines and witness statements. Telephones rang constantly as neighbors reported the slightest unusual occurrences from recent weeks. A truck I didn't recognize parked near the elementary school last Tuesday. A man watching the playground during recess. Someone asked my daughter about her walk to church. Each call added another pin to the map, another name to the growing list of people to interview. FBI agents arrived, setting up equipment in the living room, their presence both reassuring and terrifying. Confirmation that this wasn't just a misunderstanding or temporary disappearance. Outside, porch lights blazed across Cedar Falls, illuminating streets that had never before felt threatening. Parents who once let their children play unsupervised until dusk now called them inside before the afternoon shadows grew long. Doors that had remained unlocked for generations now clicked with deadbolts. Linda finally collapsed into exhausted sleep on the couch around 3 a.m, her husband's jacket draped over her shoulders. David remained awake, staring at the children's empty beds, straightening Tommy's dinosaur pajamas and Jessica's favorite stuffed rabbit, as if preparing for their return. The town that had always prided itself on trust now lay awake, listening to unfamiliar sounds and wondering which neighbor might know more than they were saying. As the search for Jessica and Tommy Parker entered its second day, false leads began flooding the Cedar Falls Police Department. A blue pickup truck had been spotted idling near St. Matthew's Lutheran Church around the time the children would have been passing by. Captain Ray Morrison dispatched 3 officers to track down the vehicle's owner, only to discover it belonged to an elderly deacon who had arrived early to prepare communion. "We're following every possible lead," Captain Morrison assured Linda and David Parker, his weathered face betraying the strain of sleepless hours. The parents sat huddled at their kitchen table, surrounded by hastily printed flyers, bearing their children's smiling faces. By midday, a gas station attendant in Waterloo claimed to have seen 2 children matching Jessica and Tommy's descriptions, holding hands with a tall man in a baseball cap. The tip sent a wave of hope through the Parker home. Linda clutched her husband's arm, her eyes briefly lighting with possibility before the inevitable crash came 3 hours later. The children were identified as local residents, safely with their father. The most unsettling lead came at dusk, a cryptic phone call to the police station, a distorted voice mentioning the singing children before hanging up. Technicians worked through the night to trace the call, only to discover it had originated from a payphone outside a convenience store with no surveillance cameras. "Each time the phone rings, my heart stops," Linda confessed to Mrs. Valenti, who had brought over a casserole that remained untouched. The neighbor squeezed her hand wordlessly, having already recounted multiple times how she'd seen Jessica and Tommy walking past her fence that Sunday morning, the little girl's hymnal clutched tightly against her chest. Outside, the autumn wind scattered golden leaves across the Parkers' lawn, where neighborhood volunteers gathered in hushed groups, organizing search parties for the following day. Maps of Cedar Falls were spread across car hoods, sections methodically divided and assigned. As darkness fell, David Parker stood on the porch, mechanically screwing in a new, brighter bulb for the porch light. "They need to see their way home," he explained to no one in particular, his voice hollow with exhaustion. Inside, Linda arranged Jessica and Tommy's favorite stuffed animals on their beds, a ritual that would continue for years to come. The community's grief hung in the air like the coming winter, but beneath it ran a current of steely determination. Church bells rang out at 9 o'clock, not their usual joyful peal, but a solemn toll that echoed through the streets of Cedar Falls. "We will find them," Captain Morrison promised, though the words felt increasingly hollow with each passing hour. "This town won't rest until Jessica and Tommy are home." The FBI arrived in Cedar Falls on a Tuesday, their dark vehicles drawing stares from locals still reeling from the disappearance. Special Agent Catherine Wilson led the federal team, immediately establishing a joint task force with Captain Ray Morrison and his officers. The Parker case had officially become a priority investigation. The resources of the Bureau now focused on finding Jessica and Tommy. Linda Parker sat at her kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of cold coffee as she answered the same questions for what felt like the 100th time. Yes, they were wearing their Sunday clothes. No, they never deviated from the route. Yes, they knew not to talk to strangers. Her voice remained steady, though exhaustion shadowed her eyes. The mother's faith sustained her through each interview, each painful recounting of that morning's goodbye. "Mrs. Parker, we need to be thorough," Agent Wilson explained gently. "Sometimes the smallest detail can break a case wide open." Meanwhile, David Parker had stopped going to work. The father spent his days transforming their basement into what Captain Morrison privately called a civilian war room. Maps of Cedar Falls covered the walls, red string connecting potential sighting locations. Timelines, witness statements, and newspaper clippings created a paper tapestry of grief and determination. "Someone saw something," David muttered as he pinned another article to the wall. "Someone knows something." The FBI methodically worked through a growing list of interviews. Jessica's teacher described a bright, artistic child who loved drawing churches and angels. Tommy's kindergarten friends were gently questioned about anyone who might have spoken to them near the playground. The custodian at St. Matthew's recalled seeing unfamiliar vehicles in the church parking lot that week, but couldn't provide specific details. Mrs. Valenti's testimony about seeing the children walking past her fence became crucial to establishing the timeline. "They were holding hands," the neighbor recalled, her voice breaking. "Tommy was swinging his hymnal. They looked so normal, just two children walking to church." As days stretched into weeks, Linda found herself clinging to her faith with white-knuckled determination. Each night, she sat in the children's bedroom, reading their favorite stories aloud to empty beds. David rarely joined her, his obsession with finding connections in his basement headquarters consuming him entirely. Captain Morrison noticed the strain between the couple, but said nothing. He'd seen it before, tragedy pulling families in different directions. The officer kept his own detailed notes, determined not to let this case become another unsolved mystery in his career. "We will find them," he promised Linda one evening. "Every resource we have is dedicated to bringing Jessica and Tommy home." What he didn't say was that with each passing day, the likelihood of finding the children alive diminished. Some truths were too cruel to speak aloud. The FBI arrived in Cedar Falls 3 days after Jessica and Tommy Parker vanished. Special Agent Melissa Donovan led a team of 4 investigators who quickly established a command post at the local police station. Captain Ray Morrison welcomed the federal assistance, though his eyes betrayed the frustration of a man who felt he should have solved this case already. "We'll need to interview everyone again," Agent Donovan explained during the first briefing. "Sometimes fresh questions reveal details witnesses didn't realize were important." The task force methodically reconstructed the children's lives. They interviewed teachers who described Jessica's artistic talent and Tommy's infectious laugh. They questioned the custodial staff at the elementary school, the Sunday school volunteers, even the mail carrier who delivered to the Parker home. No stone remained unturned, no inconsistency overlooked. Linda Parker endured endless questioning with quiet dignity. Each morning, she would make coffee for the agents working from her living room, answering the same painful inquiries with unwavering patience. When asked about Jessica's favorite hiding spots or Tommy's friends, her voice remained steady, even as her hands trembled slightly. "I keep thinking they'll walk through that door," she confided to Agent Donovan one evening. "Is that foolish after all these weeks?" "No," the agent replied. "That hope is what keeps us searching." Meanwhile, David Parker retreated to their basement, transforming it into an investigation center of his own. Maps of Cedar Falls covered the walls, red pins marking possible sightings, yellow ones indicating areas already searched. He created timelines, charts of witness statements, and compiled weather reports from that fateful October morning. His engineering mind sought patterns the authorities might have missed. Captain Morrison visited the Parker home daily, often staying late into the evening reviewing David's theories. The two men developed an unspoken language of nods and grunts as they examined evidence the FBI had deemed inconsequential. "The handyman who fixed the church boiler last summer," David said one night, pointing to a name on his list. "Did anyone check his whereabouts?" "He left town in August," Morrison replied, making a note, "but I'll run a deeper check." The investigation continued with methodical precision, but each passing day dimmed the likelihood of finding the children. The FBI's presence in Cedar Falls gradually reduced as weeks turned to months, though Agent Donovan promised Linda they weren't abandoning the case. "We'll never stop looking," she assured the mother, clasping her hands. "Sometimes these cases break years later when we least expect it." Linda nodded, her faith a fragile but persistent flame in the growing darkness of uncertainty. 6 months after Jessica and Tommy Parker vanished on their way to St. Matthew's Lutheran Church, Cedar Falls had settled into a rhythm of collective mourning. The town's pain became ritualized through silent vigils and prayer circles. A memorial formed at the church, its altar now adorned with flowers, toy angels, and handwritten prayers from community members. Children's drawings lined the walls, colorful tributes to the siblings whose laughter no longer echoed through Sunday school hallways. Each Sunday, Linda Parker would sit in the same pew, clutching the same hymnal her children once held. Her eyes would drift to the empty spaces beside her, the phantom presence of Jessica and Tommy, almost tangible in the hushed sanctuary. The congregation had learned to give her space while remaining close enough to catch her, should she falter. The passage of time brought neither closure nor answers. Linda transformed her grief into purpose, becoming a source of solace for other families facing similar tragedies. Her kitchen table became a gathering place for parents who understood the particular agony of not knowing. Her empathy became a lifeline in the silent ache of uncertainty. Her faith, a fragile but luminous thread connecting her to hope when reason offered none. David Parker retreated into a different kind of coping. Their basement transformed into a makeshift investigation room, walls covered with maps, timelines, and photographs. He spent evenings hunched over witness statements, his eyes growing weaker as he searched for patterns the police might have missed. His obsession with finding answers gradually hollowed him, carving lines into his face that aged him beyond his years. "You need to rest," Linda would whisper, bringing him tea that often went cold, untouched. "I can't," he would answer without looking up from his papers. "Not until we know." Captain Ray Morrison, though officially retired from the force, carried the Parker case with him like a shadow. His living room resembled David's basement, files stacked in careful order, theories mapped out on corkboards. The investigation had become his constant companion, the children's faces looking back at him from photographs taken in happier times. The former police captain often drove past the church, retracing the route Jessica and Tommy should have walked that autumn morning. Sometimes he would park his vehicle and walk the path himself, his eyes scanning the ground, as if the passage of seasons hadn't already erased whatever evidence might have once existed. "I missed something," he would tell himself. "Something important was right in front of us." The town continued its annual remembrance, gathering each October to honor the children whose disappearance had forever changed their sense of security. Their absence remained a wound that refused to heal, a reminder of innocence lost and questions unanswered. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The yellowed pages of the school newspaper crinkled under Captain Ray Morrison's weathered fingers. Retirement hadn't dulled his obsession with the Parker case, and this discovery felt significant. Among the children's artwork published in the spring of '91 was a crayon drawing by Jessica Parker, a simple rendering of her walking route to St. Matthew's Lutheran Church. "How did we miss this?" he muttered, squinting at a shadowy figure Jessica had drawn lurking near the corner of Maple and Church Streets. The figure wore what appeared to be a wide-brimmed hat, standing partially concealed behind a tree. At the time, investigators had dismissed it as a child's imagination, just another element in a colorful drawing. Ray placed the newspaper alongside dozens of other case files that had taken over his home office. His wife had long ago stopped suggesting he let it go. The disappearance of Jessica and Tommy had become the defining failure of his career, a wound that refused to heal even 12 years later. Across town, Linda Parker placed fresh flowers at the memorial that had become a permanent fixture at St. Matthew's. Her once auburn hair now streaked with gray, she moved with the quiet grace of someone who had learned to carry grief as a constant companion. Her faith remained, though tested beyond measure. "I still feel them here," she whispered to Reverend Williams, who had replaced the now-deceased Reverend Matthews. The church had become both sanctuary and reminder of all she had lost. Meanwhile, David Parker's health had deteriorated rapidly. His basement war room of evidence, theories, and timelines had expanded to consume their home. The obsession had cost him his job at the insurance company, and increasingly, his connection to Linda. The walls between them grew as his fixation deepened. Into this atmosphere of suspended grief arrived Michael Chen, 26, a journalist fresh out of Northwestern University. Assigned to the Cedar Falls Gazette, he found himself drawn to the town's defining tragedy. "Nobody talks about it directly," Michael told his editor after his first month in town. "But it's everywhere, in how parents never let children walk alone, in the memorial services, in the way people still look at the Parkers." When Michael discovered the old-school newspaper in the town archives, something about Jessica's drawing captured his attention. The figure in the hat seemed deliberately placed, not random. He began interviewing retired teachers, former classmates, and neighbors who remembered the Parker children. "Sometimes fresh eyes see what we've all been blind to," Ray Morrison said when Michael contacted him, reluctantly sharing his files with the young journalist. As autumn leaves again carpeted the streets of Cedar Falls, Michael's persistent questions began disturbing the town's carefully maintained silence. Some residents welcomed the renewed interest. Others resented the reopening of old wounds. But for the first time in years, the case that had haunted Cedar Falls stirred with the possibility of movement. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The Cedar Falls Police Department had nearly given up hope. The case files for Jessica and Tommy Parker had grown thin, leads exhausted, and witnesses' memories faded. But in the spring of 2003, a janitor cleaning out an abandoned storage facility near the old railway depot made a discovery that would breathe new life into the investigation. Behind a false wall in the facility's back room, officers found a space barely larger than a closet. Captain Ray Morrison, though retired for 5 years, was called immediately. His hands trembled as he surveyed the contents. A small collection of children's items, a hair ribbon matching Jessica's description, a toy car similar to one Tommy had carried, and most disturbingly, a leather-bound notebook. "I knew we had something significant," Morrison later told reporters. "The moment I opened that diary, my blood ran cold." The notebook contained meticulous observations of local children's routines, when they left for school, which routes they took, who walked alone. Jessica and Tommy Parker featured prominently, with detailed notes about their Sunday walks to St. Matthew's Lutheran Church. The writing was cramped but methodical, the work of someone who had watched and waited for the perfect opportunity. Forensic analysts worked tirelessly to identify the handwriting. After weeks of comparison, they found a match in the Cedar Falls Municipal Archives. Maintenance request forms signed by a man who had worked briefly as a handyman around town in the early 90s, including at St. Matthew's. He was practically invisible, Mrs. Valenti recalled when interviewed again. The kind of person you'd see but never really notice. He fixed things at the church, at the school. He was everywhere. The handyman had left town shortly after the Parker children vanished. Records showed he had moved between small Midwestern communities, never staying longer than a year or two. In each location, he had sought positions that granted access to places frequented by children. Linda Parker received the news with quiet resolve. "I always sensed someone had been watching them," she told Michael Chen, a young journalist who had recently taken interest in the cold case. "A mother knows these things." David Parker added the new information to his basement war room, pinning locations on maps and creating timelines with renewed vigor despite his failing health. The diary revealed a predator's calculating patience, someone who had integrated himself into the community's fabric while harboring the darkest of intentions. Its discovery transformed the investigation from a tragic mystery into a manhunt for a suspect who had been hiding in plain sight all along. For the first time in over a decade, Cedar Falls dared to hope that answers might finally be within reach. After 23 years of dead ends, the investigation finally gained momentum when Detective Ray Morrison, now retired but still haunted by the case, received a call about an abandoned storage facility near the old railway depot in Cedar Falls. What they discovered inside sent shockwaves through the investigation team. Behind a false wall in the facility, officers uncovered a hidden room that appeared frozen in time. Faded children's clothing lay neatly folded on a shelf. Toys, some still in their original packaging, were arranged in precise rows. But most disturbing was a leather-bound diary discovered beneath a floorboard, its pages filled with meticulous notes about local children's routines, when they left for school, which routes they took, and which ones walked alone. The handwriting was distinctive, Morrison explained to Linda Parker as they sat in her kitchen. Something about those loops and slants seemed familiar. Forensic experts confirmed his suspicion, matching the script to letters written by a man who had briefly worked as a handyman around town in the early 90s. The man, Gerald Hoffman, had performed odd jobs at St. Matthew's Lutheran Church and several other buildings around Cedar Falls. He had seemed unremarkable at the time, quiet, efficient, and largely forgettable. Records showed he had been hired for temporary maintenance work at the church just weeks before Jessica and Tommy disappeared, but investigators had never thoroughly examined his background. "We interviewed him back then," Morrison admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "But he was just one of dozens of people connected to the church. Nothing stood out." Now living under the name Thomas Welch in a small town in Nebraska, Hoffman had built a new life. Working as a night janitor at a local school, FBI agents apprehended him without incident as he arrived for his shift. During the interrogation, Hoffman's demeanor shifted between detached calm and agitated defensiveness. "I never planned anything," he insisted, his eyes fixed on the table. "I saw them walking that morning, looking so perfect in their Sunday clothes. It was impulse, just impulse." His confession, while incriminating, offered little comfort to the Parker family. Hoffman claimed he couldn't remember details, contradicted himself repeatedly, and refused to disclose what happened after he took the children. His arbitrary cruelty, the randomness of his choice, only deepened the family's anguish. David Parker collapsed upon hearing the news, his already fragile health buckling under the weight of this partial truth. Linda sat stone-faced as Captain Morrison relayed the details, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles turned white. "He just saw them and decided," she whispered, "all these years of suffering because he had an impulse?" The diary revealed a predator who had watched and waited, studying the vulnerable moments in children's daily routines. For the Parkers, knowing their children had been targeted in such a calculated way brought a new dimension to their grief, one that offered answers but no peace. Linda Parker sat at the kitchen table, her trembling fingers wrapped around a cold cup of coffee. The FBI agent's words about the handyman's confession echoed in her mind, hollow and unsatisfying. Outside, autumn leaves swirled in patterns that reminded her of that fateful morning in 1991. They were so excited about their new hymnals, she whispered to the empty room. The memory of Jessica's careful braids and Tommy's crooked collar flooded back with painful clarity. Linda replayed that morning for the 1,000th time, the casual goodbye, the way she had watched them from the porch for only a moment before turning back inside. A walk to church they had done dozens of times before. "I should have driven them," she said, her voice breaking. "I should have walked with them." The weight of these simple alternatives crushed her chest. What once seemed like nurturing independence now felt like unforgivable negligence. Across town, David Parker hunched over case files in his basement war room. The walls, plastered with timelines and photographs, had been his sanctuary and prison for over a decade. The handyman's confession should have brought relief, but instead left him hollow. "He says he acted on impulse," David muttered, reading the transcript again. "No planning, just saw them and took them." The randomness of it all was perhaps the cruelest revelation, that their children's fate hinged not on something preventable, but on terrible chance. The phone rang upstairs. David heard Linda answer it, her voice a distant murmur. They moved through the house like ghosts now, occupying the same space but rarely connecting. Their marriage, once strengthened by shared purpose, now strained under the weight of different grieving styles. When Linda appeared at the basement door, her eyes were red-rimmed. "That was Captain Morrison," she said. "They're questioning him again tomorrow." David nodded, unable to meet her gaze. "He's lying about parts of it. The diary they found shows planning. Years of it. Does it matter now?" Linda asked softly. "Will knowing every detail bring them back?" The question hung between them, exposing the fundamental difference in their approaches to loss. For David, every detail mattered. For Linda, the absence itself was the only reality. "I need to know," he finally said. "I promised them I would find out what happened." Linda stepped into the room, touching a photograph of Jessica and Tommy on the wall. "I promised them I would keep them safe," she whispered. "We both failed." They stood in silence, two people bound by love and broken by the same tragedy, uncertain if their marriage could survive the partial truth that now lay before them. Michael Chen's series of articles in the Cedar Falls Chronicle brought the Parker case back into the spotlight with a fresh perspective. The children of St. Matthew's, forgotten but not gone, painted Jessica and Tommy not as faded photographs, but as vibrant children with dreams and personalities. He described Jessica's talent for drawing and Tommy's infectious laugh that once echoed through the church halls. The young journalist meticulously reconstructed their final known moments, interviewing classmates now grown with children of their own. Not everyone welcomed this resurrection of painful memories. At the local diner, whispers circulated that some wounds were better left undisturbed. "This town has grieved enough," muttered Harold Jenkins, whose daughter had been in Jessica's class. "Chen's stirring up ghosts for newspaper sales." But for others, the articles provided a long-awaited voice. Mrs. Valenti, now in her 80s but sharp as ever, finally felt her account was being properly considered. "That boy listens," she told her neighbors, "really listens." The impact reached beyond emotional resonance. Chen's meticulous timeline analysis highlighted inconsistencies in the original investigation that law enforcement could no longer ignore. His third article questioned why the handyman's employment records had never been cross-referenced with other missing children cases in the region. Captain Ray Morrison sat at his kitchen table, coffee growing cold as he absorbed Chen's words. The retired officer's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the telephone. His wife watched silently, recognizing the look in his eyes. Determination mingled with the weight of an unfulfilled promise. "This is Morrison," he said when Chen answered. "I think we should talk." They met at the captain's home, surrounded by cardboard boxes filled with case files that Morrison had never returned to the station. "These aren't copies," he admitted. "I couldn't let them gather dust in storage." Chen studied the older man's face, lined with years of carrying this burden. "You never stopped investigating, did you?" "I made a promise to Linda Parker the day those children vanished," Morrison replied, his voice steady, despite the emotion behind it. "Said I'd bring them home." Together they spread the yellow documents across Morrison's dining room table. Interview transcripts, search grid maps, witness statements, creating a tapestry of a 32-year-old tragedy. "There's something here," Morrison insisted, tapping a folder with his weathered finger. "Something we all missed, and it might be my last chance to make things right." Michael Chen's persistent reporting had breathed new life into a case many in Cedar Falls had reluctantly filed away in their collective memory. His articles in the local paper meticulously reconstructed the lives of Jessica and Tommy Parker, not as frozen images on missing posters, but as vibrant children whose absence still echoed through the community. While some townspeople winced at reopening wounds that had never fully healed, others found themselves drawn to his compassionate storytelling. "These children deserve to be remembered as more than a tragedy," Michael told his editor, his desk cluttered with interview notes and archived police reports. His series had carefully balanced the human elements with investigative journalism, avoiding sensationalism while maintaining pressure on law enforcement to re-examine evidence. Captain Ray Morrison, now well into retirement with silver hair and deepening wrinkles, found himself captivated by Chen's articles. The former police captain had never truly stepped away from the case that defined his career. His home office remained a shrine to the investigation. Boxes of files, photographs, and timelines that his wife had long ago stopped asking him to put away. One evening, Morrison picked up the phone. "Mr. Chen, Ray Morrison here. I think we should talk." Their first meeting at a quiet diner outside town stretched from afternoon into evening. Morrison brought his meticulously organized files, while Michael arrived with fresh perspectives and questions nobody had thought to ask decades ago. "I've been waiting for someone to see what I've been seeing," the retired captain confessed, his weathered hands tracing timelines he knew by heart. "These children are still out there somewhere. I made a promise to Linda Parker I'd never stop looking." Together, they formed an unlikely alliance, the aging lawman whose oath still bound him to a case gone cold, and the young journalist whose outsider perspective allowed him to question long-held assumptions. They began methodically revisiting witness statements, comparing notes on inconsistencies, and identifying gaps in the original investigation. "Everyone gets tunnel vision eventually," Morrison explained as they pored over documents in his home office. "We focus on what makes sense and discard what doesn't fit our theories. But sometimes, the answer is hiding in what we overlooked." Michael nodded, understanding the weight of those words. "Then let's find what everyone missed," he said, determination hardening his voice. "One last chance to get this right." Neither man could have predicted how soon their collaboration would bear fruit, or how deeply buried the truth had been all along, hidden not in distant fields or forgotten evidence boxes, but beneath the very place where two children had been heading on that autumn morning so many years ago. The workers moved methodically through the church basement, their flashlights cutting through decades of dust and shadow. Linda Parker watched from the doorway, her hands clasped tightly at her chest. Captain Ray Morrison stood beside her, his weathered face set in determined lines despite the years of retirement that had etched themselves into his features. "Over here," called one of the workers, his voice echoing against the stone walls. There's something behind this old furnace. The discovery of Reverend Matthew's letter mentioning the abandoned boiler repair had been Michael Chen's breakthrough. The young journalist had spent weeks piecing together fragments of information that others had missed, his persistence finally yielding this moment of possibility. "Be careful," Morrison instructed, as two men carefully shifted the ancient furnace away from the wall. The metal groaned in protest, scraping against the concrete floor. Linda flinched at the sound, remembering how Jessica and Tommy had always been frightened of the basement's strange noises during Sunday school. As the furnace moved, it revealed a small, irregular opening in the wall, a compartment that shouldn't exist. Morrison knelt down, his knees protesting, and shone his flashlight into the darkness. His breath caught audibly. "Linda," he said softly, "I think you should see this." She moved forward on unsteady legs, the weight of 32 years of uncertainty making each step heavier than the last. Kneeling beside the former police captain, she peered into the hidden space. There, nestled in a hollow that had remained untouched for decades, lay two small hymnals. "Oh my God," Linda whispered, her voice barely audible. The room fell silent as one of the officers carefully extracted the books, placing them gently on a clean cloth. The hymnals' blue covers were faded and dusty, but Linda recognized them instantly. These were the books she had placed in her children's hands that crisp autumn morning in 1991, watching as Jessica and Tommy had walked down the leaf-strewn sidewalk toward St. Matthew's. Michael Chen stood back, notebook forgotten in his hand, witnessing the moment when a mother's endless weight intersected with a fragment of truth. He saw how Linda's fingers trembled as she reached toward the hymnals, how her shoulders shook with silent emotion. "These are theirs," she confirmed, tears streaming down her face. Jessica always drew little crosses in the corners of her pages. And Tommy, her voice broke as she pointed to a childish scrawl on the inside cover of the smaller book. Morrison placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, his own eyes glistening. After decades of searching, the aging furnace had kept its secret, a secret that might finally lead them to the truth about what happened to the Parker children on their way to church. Behind the church's aging furnace, workers discovered a dusty, concealed compartment. Inside lay two children's hymnals, their covers faded but unmistakable. The moment the workers called out their discovery, the basement fell silent. Linda Parker rushed forward, her heart pounding in her chest. Captain Ray Morrison placed a steadying hand on her shoulder as she knelt beside the opening in the wall. "Those are theirs," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the hushed space. "Those are Jessica and Tommy's hymnals." The small books lay side by side, their once bright covers now dulled by decades of darkness. Linda reached with trembling fingers, hesitating just before touching them, as if they might dissolve into dust, taking with them this tangible connection to her children. Michael Chen stood back, notebook forgotten in his hand, witnessing the raw emotion of a mother reconnecting with pieces of her lost children. The young journalist had spent months researching the case, but nothing had prepared him for the weight of this moment. "We should document everything exactly as it is," Morrison said gently, his years of investigative experience guiding him even in retirement. A forensic technician carefully photographed the scene before Linda was allowed to lift the books. The mother recognized them instantly. Jessica's hymnal with the small heart she had drawn in the corner, Tommy's with his name printed in wobbly letters. The familiar handwriting transported her back to that autumn morning in 1991, when she had watched her children walk away, hymnals clutched in their small hands. "Look," she said, opening Jessica's book with reverent care. She always folded the corners of her favorite songs. As she turned the pages, something slipped out, a folded piece of paper, preserved between the pages of hymn 316, "What a Friend We Have in Jesus." Linda unfolded it with shaking hands. The note was written in Jessica's careful handwriting, the letters formed with childlike precision. We're scared, but together. We love Mommy and Daddy. Jesus will look after us. Linda's composure finally broke. Tears streamed silently down her face as she clutched the note to her chest. David stood frozen, unable to approach, the weight of 32 years of searching visible in the slump of his shoulders. Michael captured the moment with quiet respect, knowing his reporting would forever memorialize this discovery. The hymnals, these simple objects that had accompanied Jessica and Tommy Parker on their final journey, had survived to tell a fragment of their story, weaving the family's enduring hope and devastating loss into Cedar Falls' collective memory. The forensic team worked meticulously, their findings confirming what everyone had feared yet hoped for. The hymnals had indeed been hidden since the early 90s, precisely during the time Jessica and Tommy Parker disappeared. Dust patterns and material degradation matched the timeline exactly, creating an undeniable connection to that fateful Sunday morning. The compartment behind the church furnace had remained untouched for over 3 decades, a secret chamber that held the last tangible pieces of the children's existence. The space could only have been accessed during the renovation period, explained the lead forensic analyst, pointing to maintenance records that aligned perfectly with the former handyman's brief employment at St. Matthew's. The man who had moved between communities, leaving devastation in his wake, had created this hiding place during his temporary position at the church, a chilling testament to premeditation rather than impulse. Captain Ray Morrison sat heavily in the back pew, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he reviewed the report. The realization crushed him. If someone had simply moved that furnace years ago during the initial investigation, the Parkers might have had answers decades earlier. A single overlooked detail had prolonged their agony for 32 years. "We checked everywhere," he whispered to Michael Chen, who sat beside him taking notes. "Everywhere except behind that damn furnace." The journalist placed a compassionate hand on the retired officer's shoulder, understanding the weight of hindsight. Throughout Cedar Falls, similar waves of collective regret rippled through the community. Longtime residents who had participated in the original search parties questioned their thoroughness, wondering how they could have missed something so close to where the children were last seen. Linda Parker, however, showed remarkable grace when informed of the findings. "We can't change the past," she told the investigators gathered in her living room, David sitting silently beside her, his eyes fixed on the forensic photographs. "What matters is that we know now." The town held an emergency council meeting that evening, the church hall filled beyond capacity as residents grappled with the implications. Some expressed anger at the oversight, while others acknowledged the limitations of the initial search. The mayor, visibly shaken, proposed new protocols for missing persons cases, determined that such a critical error would never happen again in Cedar Falls. As night fell, volunteers placed candles along the path from the Parker home to St. Matthew's, the route Jessica and Tommy never completed. The flickering lights illuminated sidewalks once taken for granted as safe passages, a somber reminder of vigilance lost and lessons learned at tremendous cost. The town's innocence, like the hidden compartment, had remained sealed away for decades, now exposed to the harsh light of truth. The forensic team confirmed what everyone had feared. The hymnals had remained hidden since the early 1990s, exactly when Jessica and Tommy Parker vanished. Captain Ray Morrison stood in the church basement, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he examined photographs of the compartment behind the old furnace. This space, accessible only during the brief window when the handyman worked at St. Matthew's, had concealed crucial evidence for over 3 decades. He knew exactly what he was doing, the retired officer muttered to Michael Chen, who was taking notes nearby. "The timing matches his employment records perfectly." The journalist nodded, his expression somber. Linda Parker had insisted on being present when they processed the scene, her quiet dignity a testament to years of enduring the unendurable. David remained at home, his health too fragile for this final confrontation with truth. FBI agents expanded their investigation, pulling employment records from churches, schools, and community centers across the Midwest. A disturbing pattern emerged. The suspect had drifted between small towns, staying just long enough to gain minimal trust before disappearing. In each location, children had gone missing. He targeted communities like Cedar Falls deliberately, explained the lead FBI investigator. Places where trust ran deep, where children could walk to church alone without anyone thinking twice. The discovery that a single overlooked detail, moving an old furnace during routine maintenance, could have ended decades of agony, haunted everyone involved. Mrs. Valenti, now elderly but sharp-minded, wept openly when told about the hymnals. "I saw them that morning," she whispered. "If only I'd watched them longer." For Linda, the revelation brought complicated emotions. The knowledge that her children had been in the church basement, possibly alive long enough for Jessica to write her note, was both comforting and devastating. The handyman's partial confession offered little closure. Despite intense questioning, he refused to reveal what happened after hiding the children or where their remains might be found. "Some monsters feed on withholding," Morrison explained to Michael as they reviewed case files. "It's the last power he has." The town grappled with collective guilt and the limits of its vigilance. How had someone worked among them, in their sacred spaces, while harboring such darkness? The church board members, who had hired the handyman without thorough background checks, carried a particularly heavy burden. Michael's articles carefully balanced the painful revelations with sensitivity toward the Parker family. "The compartment behind the furnace," he wrote, "stands as a testament to how close the truth was all along, hidden in plain sight, beneath the very place where the community gathered to pray for Jessica and Tommy's return." The hymnals, preserved as evidence, would eventually be returned to Linda. Tangible connections to the children whose fate remained partially shrouded in mystery. Further investigation into the handyman's history revealed a disturbing pattern that sent chills through the entire investigative team. FBI agents discovered that Walter Simmons, the former church handyman, had methodically moved between small towns across the Midwest during the 1980s and 90s, leaving a trail of similar disappearances in his wake. He targeted communities where trust was the foundation, Captain Ray Morrison explained to Linda and David Parker during a painful briefing at their home. Places where children could walk to church alone without anyone thinking twice. The pattern was unmistakable once assembled on the evidence board. 5 other cases spanning Illinois, Minnesota, and Wisconsin shared eerie similarities with what happened to Jessica and Tommy. In each instance, Simmons had secured temporary maintenance work at community centers, schools, or churches, positions that allowed him to observe children's routines without drawing attention. Despite mounting evidence and his partial confession about the Parker children, Walter refused to provide closure on one critical detail. During intensive interrogations, he maintained a calculated silence about where he had taken the bodies, denying the families even this final mercy. "I've said all I'm going to say," he told investigators, his face betraying no emotion. "Some things should stay buried." Linda collapsed when she heard these words, her shoulders heaving with silent sobs as David held her, his own face twisted with rage and grief. The cruelty of this final withholding seemed to break something fundamental in both of them. Michael Chen, who had been granted limited access to the investigation, wrote in his column, "The refusal to disclose the children's resting place represents perhaps the final act of control by a man who has already stolen so much from so many families." For the residents of Cedar Falls, the revelation that a predator had deliberately chosen their community for its trusting nature transformed their collective grief into something darker. Parents who had once allowed their children to roam freely now implemented strict check-in procedures. The church, once a sanctuary, now carried the shadow of what had been hidden within its walls for decades. "We were chosen because we believed in the goodness of people," Mrs. Valenti said during a community meeting at the town hall. "I don't know if we can ever get that back." As the investigation expanded to include cold cases from neighboring states, the Parker family faced the grim reality that they might never recover Jessica and Tommy's remains. Despite this unbearable truth, Linda found herself reaching out to other families connected to Simmons, forming a fragile network of shared pain and understanding that transcended state lines and decades of suffering. The pews of St. Matthew's Lutheran Church overflowed as residents gathered for the memorial service. Jessica and Tommy Parker's hymnals rested on a small table draped in white cloth, flanked by their school photographs and the heart-wrenching note in Jessica's childish script. 32 years of questions had yielded incomplete answers, but these sacred objects offered tangible proof of the children's final moments. Linda Parker stood before the congregation, her silver-streaked hair catching the light streaming through stained glass windows. She didn't speak, couldn't speak, but her presence communicated more than words ever could. The mother's quiet dignity touched everyone present, a testament to endurance through unimaginable pain. David sat in the front row, his shoulders hunched with the weight of decades. The obsession that had consumed him had given way to a fragile acceptance. He reached for his wife's hand as she returned to his side, their fingers intertwining in a gesture that spoke of shared sorrow and resilience. Captain Ray Morrison watched from the back, his weathered face revealing the toll the case had taken. The retired officer had never stopped searching, and though the resolution remained incomplete, finding the hymnals had brought a measure of peace to the man who'd carried this burden throughout his career. "We gather not just to mourn," Reverend Wilson said, his voice echoing through the sanctuary, "but to honor the memory of two beloved children whose spirits have remained alive in our hearts." Michael Chen observed from a respectful distance, notebook closed out of deference. The journalist had become part of Cedar Falls' story, his persistent reporting helping to piece together fragments of truth that might otherwise have remained buried forever. Mrs. Valenti dabbed at her eyes, remembering the bright morning when she had been the last neighbor to see the siblings walking past her fence. The elderly woman had repeated her account countless times over the years, clinging to that final glimpse as if it might somehow change the outcome. After the service, community members embraced the Parkers, offering quiet words of support. Linda found solace in their collective embrace, drawing strength from the knowledge that her children would never be forgotten in this town that had been forever changed by their loss. The church bells tolled as people filed out into the autumn afternoon. Cedar Falls had lost its innocence that Sunday morning in 1991, but in its place had grown something equally valuable: a community bound by shared grief, mutual support, and an unwavering commitment to remember. Though the handyman had refused to provide complete closure, the discovery of the hymnals had given the town something tangible to hold on to, a physical connection to Jessica and Tommy that transcended their absence. Life in Cedar Falls slowly resumed its rhythms, forever altered by loss, but held together by the bonds forged in shared pain. The town's innocence was gone, replaced by a deeper, more complex resilience. Children no longer walked alone to St. Matthew's Lutheran Church. Parents exchanged knowing glances as they accompanied their little ones, a silent acknowledgement of what had been learned at too high a cost. Linda Parker found purpose in her grief, channeling decades of anguish into advocacy for families of missing children. Her quiet strength became legendary across Iowa and beyond. She established a support network that connected parents navigating the same impossible terrain of uncertainty and hope. When cameras and reporters had long moved on to other stories, she remained, holding hands with mothers and fathers in their darkest hours. "Some wounds never fully heal," she often told them, "but we learn to carry them with grace." David struggled differently. His obsession with the case had taken its toll, leaving him physically weakened but spiritually renewed once the partial truth emerged. The couple, whose marriage had weathered unimaginable strain, found their way back to each other through shared memories of Jessica and Tommy, rather than the shadow of their absence. Michael Chen's reporting sparked renewed national attention to other cold cases. His series on the Parker children won journalism awards, but he valued most the letter Linda sent him, thanking him for ensuring her children's story would never be forgotten. The young journalist continued investigating similar disappearances across the Midwest, determined that no parent should wait 32 years for answers. Captain Morrison, though retired, found peace in knowing he had fulfilled his promise to the community. He still visited the church every Sunday, sitting quietly in the back pew, his presence a testament to dedication that transcended professional duty. Cedar Falls marked the anniversary differently now. What had once been solely a day of mourning transformed into Parker Day, when the community gathered not just to remember Jessica and Tommy, but to celebrate resilience and vigilance. Schools taught children about safety, while honoring the siblings whose tragedy had ultimately strengthened the fabric of their town. The handyman remained imprisoned, his silence about the children's final resting place an ongoing torment. Yet somehow, the discovery of the hymnals had provided what Linda called enough. Enough to know her children had faced their fear together. Enough to feel their presence in the carefully preserved pages. Enough to continue living with purpose, rather than drowning in uncertainty.